Welcome back to Learning Unity with the 3D Game Kit. In this video, we're moving forward in the 3D asset creation pipeline by setting up the Game Ready Mesh. We'll go through the process of optimizing the model, creating clean UVs, and doing a quick test bake in Maya to ensure everything's ready for texturing. This step is critical to make sure that when we bring our assets into Substance Painter for baking and texturing in the next section, we'll get the best possible results. So let's dive in and get the model prepared. We're done with our high poly for now, so I can put that on a layer. I could go ahead and name this high poly. And then just set that to _L, since it doesn't want it to have the same name, to be invisible. Now let's bring back our blockout mesh, and we're going to utilize this blockout mesh to build our game mesh. This is, for the most part, ready to go for the game mesh. There's not really a whole lot that needs to happen here. There's only a handful of things we might want to adjust. So when we talk about a game mesh is going to be what actually goes into the engine, and we want it to be as optimized as possible. Now, there's a lot of different steps to optimization, but one of which is going to be the poly count, using this efficiently and getting it as low as possible. There is a catch to this, though, because you also need to be able to bake correctly. So quite often when it comes to making game art, there's the pre-bake game art, and then there's the post-bake. And what do I mean by that? There's probably more reduction we can do after the bake, potentially, than before, and that's because the bake mesh sometimes needs extra normal information to be accurate. Now, something this simple should be okay. What we can do to help reduce this down is we can take these edges here that don't serve a purpose, and we can go ahead and collapse them. So I'm going to select the two edges here running vertically. I'm going to come up here to our edit mesh here. I'm going to select collapse. What collapse does is it basically brings those down and welds them. Now, here's the iffy part. I might be able to take this down further by going into my edge mode here and using a target weld and bringing this down to this corner. And what you'll see now is we just have these triangles going up. Likewise, I could potentially bring it up here as well. I think the bottom corner would be safer. And you can see that will help us reduce this down and get this even further optimized. So at this stage, I think this chunk here is about as optimized as we're going to get. And you can see we have that down to 36 tries, which is pretty awesome. Now these pieces here, there's not a whole lot we can do with these, but there still is quite a bit. For example, all of these interfaces we don't need. A general rule of thumb is if you don't see it, you don't need it. And there's nothing wrong leaving just a shell like this. You'll see no one will know, right? The other area is the center. Unless we're mirroring, we don't need this. So we could do an edit mesh, delete edge and vertex, and just get something nice and clean here like this. You'll see this brings this chunk down to 58, whereas the other ones are 76. So I'm going to select these guys and we'll just repeat the process here, deleting them and their interior, and then deleting that center edge that doesn't have a purpose with edit mesh, delete edge, and vertex. And at this point, our game mesh is optimized. We're ready to go, and we don't really need to have any other changes yet. This little guy here, nothing you need to do. We already optimized that guy for games. All right, so that's going to be it. We could potentially reduce the number of these, but that's something we would do after. This, however, is golden. So what we need to do now is we need to set up some UVs to put textures on this and do an initial bake. So let's go ahead and dive in and take a look at UVs now. Before we get to the UVs, we do want to delete the history on this and freeze the transform. That will make it so when we unfold things, we don't run into nasty surprises. You can access the UV menu here and go into the UV editor to get this floating screen. This is what I usually do, and I have it up on my second monitor. But I'm going to set this up so you guys can see it easier by coming to Windows, Workspaces, and switching to UV Edit. So if you don't have two monitors like me and you have a single monitor, this layout is excellent for this process. Now, what we're going to see here is a hot mess. For those of you who need a refresher, UVs are a 2D representation of a 3D asset that allows us to map two-dimensional textures on the three-dimensional surface. So what we're essentially doing is we're chopping this up into a 2D representation of itself, and we're making like a sticker sheet. So if you ever played with toys when you were little that you needed to put stickers on certain parts, this is the same concept. I'll start by selecting this piece here, and I'm going to go ahead and isolate it using the isolate select. This will make it so I can see it easier on its own. The first step I like to take when I'm doing a UV layout here is I like to come in here to create, and I like to just do a camera-based projection. What this does is it gets us fresh UVs across the whole thing, and we can come in here and start cutting this apart, kind of like we would do with scissors. I can go into edge mode here, and I can come along these front faces in terms of their border edge, and I can cut these like so by shift selecting them. And then I could do the same for the backside. I can shift select these and just get the side edges. Make sure you get them all if possible. And then we can come to our cut menu here and we can just do a cut. And what this is going to do, if I go into my UV mode here, or UV shell mode rather, is it's going to let me bring out these chunks here so that I just have a front, a back, and then this side area here. Now the side area we can treat kind of like a box, and we can come in and we can cut it on each edge. General rule of thumb is when you're working on a game asset, if it has a 90-degree angle, it should have a cut. So I don't need to cut here, for example, because it doesn't have a 90-degree angle, but here I probably should. So we'll hit cut, and that will separate this guy into chunks here in terms of UV shells. Now, the reason why you want to do those cuts on 90-degree angles actually has to do with the baking process, which we're going to get to after this. But with these set up here, I can just go back into objects mode. Now that we have these chunks in place, we can go ahead and do an unfold. I'm going to do the unfold by coming here to modify, and we're going to look for the unfold option here, which is towards the bottom. If we go ahead and click that, that should unfold these nicely. And what we should start to see here is these nice quads. Now, what I'm going to want to do is just rotate these to be nicely in place. I could also try and use some automated layout tools. For example, if I come in here to modify and layout, we can adjust these to layout for us. One of the things I like to do is I like to make sure we have preserved 3D ratios on. This will make sure they're the same size. I make sure rotate and translate are off here, but we can use the shell pre-rotate here to try and rotate these to be straight. So for example, I could try horizontal. Down here, we can adjust the padding settings. The Polycount website has really good information on edge padding. So if you Google Polycount edge padding, it should be one of the first things that comes up here. So if you come in here, they have a great article on edge padding where it talks all about it. In terms of what I like to grab from here is the minimum padding section here. So I'm going to do a 1024 texture since that's pretty standard for games, or you could do a 2048. How about we do a 2048 so it matches up with everything else? But you'll see what we'll want there is 16 by 16, which I already have set, and we can click apply. Now that didn't come out quite right, so let me switch this from horizontal to vertical and see if that gives us a better rotation. The other thing I want to make sure is they're not overlapping. You can see this packed together non-overlapping is selected here. That normally makes it so they don't overlap. So I don't really know what's going on there. That's kind of interesting, but we can sort that out automatically by just kind of moving them. The main thing I want to have here is I do want to have them all separated into their own little space. So that way I can come in here and easily take a look at how these are laid out. So something like that is going to be our end goal for this one here. And I'll need to play around with this layout. I haven't played with 2025 too much. I'm kind of curious why the the non-overlapping here is not working. But if I switch this to off, we could try that. It's still not working. Very interesting. I could also try the legacy version here, and it looks like if I switch this to legacy, it will work, which is kind of interesting. I don't know why, but if you do want to get the spacing right, you can come to legacy. You could come down here to 2048, and then you could play around with this, and we could manually lay these out later. So we'll have to play around with that as we go. Maya's finicky. There's always something weird with the tools, but that will get my UV layout for this guy. Now, in terms of what we're looking for with a UV layout, you want to make sure you have nice even squares across the surface and minimal stretching. I have some tools turned on that are helping me see that in the UV editor. Yours may look differently. These are going to be the tools here for visualization. The second one here I have is showing the shell color. This allows me to see when there's overlapping or inside out shells. If we switch to the first one here, you'll see that it just shows the checkerboard. The checkerboard is this icon here. That puts a checkerboard texture onto it so we can check the stretching. There's a third option here that is going to cover stretching and compression, and ours should be good. So just be mindful, that's what those are going to do. Now, the next things I need to view are going to be these guys here. And we can follow a very similar process of just going to create camera-based, and if I wanted to, I could actually just hit G across these to repeat, and then we could come through and do our cuts. Now, remember, if it's a 90-degree angle, it gets cut. So this here, we're probably going to cut along these edges. And then as far as everything else goes, we can just do a cut along the top to get a top shape, a cut along the bottom to get a bottom shape, and we have no interior, so this should be fine. If I go ahead and hit cut now, we can click this and do a modify unfold, and that should give us the pieces we need, in which case usually doing a layout works. I'll do a similar setup where I use the unfold 3D layout here. We'll go ahead and set this to horizontal or vertical. Looks like horizontal gave me a good result. And that will go ahead and just rotate these into position so that I can see what their shapes look like. We'll probably pack a lot of these manually, but that should give us some nice UVs. We can do the same check here so we can see what's going on. Now, if we want to save a bit of time, we can probably transfer UVs from this onto these ones by selecting this first, shift selecting that one, and by doing a mesh transfer attributes. So if we come here to mesh, you'll see here's transfer attributes. We can use the options here, and transfer attributes allows us to transfer a whole bunch of things. What we usually use it for is this, UV sets and color sets. You'll see I have it set for all. This is okay. That's going to be what I want to do. Next is going to be the space we want to transfer in. Now, these are duplicates of each other, so we can either use topology or component. Component tends to be better. I don't know the difference between the two exactly. Component, I think, has to deal with IDs, the actual identification, whereas topology is more structure. In terms of mirroring, we don't need any. We don't need to flip the UVs, so we can set those to off. For color borders and search method, color border doesn't matter. I'll just leave preserve on, as is the default. For search method, you can see closest along normal or closest to point. These are troubleshooting options. So if this doesn't work, I could flip this one on and see if it does. And if none of that works, I could come up here and try topology. So it's kind of a interesting method. But if I go and hit apply, you'll see this one gets the UVs no problem. And then I can do the same down here and hit apply. And there you go. You could also lay these out manually, each one, if this doesn't work, but that will get this set up for you. Now, a very important step, though, is after doing this, you need to delete the history. Otherwise, it's still linked to this one. So if we start moving these around in our layout, we could have issues. So let's just highlight those, delete all by type history, and clear that out. So now that I have all these together, I could also try the layout again. We could do modify layout here. I could try unfold 3D with this turned off, see if that works. It's not. So this would work normally. There's probably a bug fixed for 2025 I'm not aware of, so I might download that after. But we could go into the legacy mode here and just make sure that we have it set to preserve 3D ratios. And I don't see an option for that. So what that means is we need to do the prescale here. You could either do object or world. I think world's the one we would want, and that's going to make those relative to the world. We could play around with object as well. They should be pretty much the same. So something like that's going to get them to be about the right size. And we'll manually place these in a moment, but as long as they're about the right size and fitting into space, that's what we care about. Now, the last thing is this little guy, the laser. We really don't need a whole lot for the laser. And as a matter of fact, if we wanted to, we don't even necessarily need to lay out the UVs for this. We could just use a material, but it's good practice to lay out the UVs. So for this, I would just do a camera-based projection, and then I'd come to the bottom here and just do a cut along the bottom. And we could do a modify unfold now. So that way it's laid out. And if I want to straighten this, in this case, since it's just one object and it's a cube, I could get it close and then just do a modify straighten UVs. So down here, you'll see there's straighten border. The one that usually works best is straighten UVs though, and that will straighten that right out. Now, just like I did with the other ones, we could do a layout here where we do our modify layout and get that placed in there. Once again, I am using the legacy because the unfold 3D is broken, because the shell stacking for some reason doesn't seem to be working. So we'll just do the legacy layout and call that good. All right, so that's going to get this guy UV'd. Once you have the UVs done, go ahead and delete the history, freeze the transforms again. And what we're going to do now is just manually lay these out to look a little bit nicer and optimize them to be a little bit better for what we are aiming for. Make sure you save as you go. That way you don't lose any data once you have them laid out, because that's one of the more challenging things to do. All right, so now that we have these all placed in here, what we want to do is we want to lay these out. And when you lay out UVs, you want to do it for a couple different reasons. One is the bake. You want to make sure that there's no issues with overlapping or anything like that. Another reason you want to do it is texturing, to make texturing easier. So for example, since this is a mechanical gate, maybe we'd want to add some writing on it, like gate 01 or something like that. We'd want to make it very easy and logical to do that. Then the other aspect for games is just optimization. You want to optimize as much detail as you can into these, and automatic methods like we've done don't necessarily work out that well. Now, certain things like these big panels, these are probably good to go, but the smaller stuff, we can probably interlink and we can scale up a lot. So let's start with one chunk at a time here. I'm going to start with the big panel since it's the main attraction, and I'm just going to flip these so they're going the right way. So what I'll do here is I'll just hold down J to go in increments. So that way I can flip this around, and then I'll move this over, but have a little bit of a gap in between for that padding, right? I'm going to have to manually do the padding because it didn't want to work for me. Now I'm also going to check this and decide if I want to keep this or not. I think I do. I'll keep that ledge there. It's kind of big, but should be okay. And I'll just move these over from each other slightly so we have a little bit of padding. This also probably should be brought in from the edge if it's touching it. Usually it's not a big problem if they're touching, but textures do repeat off screen. So I might want to just take everything in here and scale it down an edge, at least for these. You usually want to keep things uniform, which means they stay together. But what I'll do here is I'll just bring this down and just do a little scale, not a lot. That way we're inside our UVs and not going outside of them. Normally my layout would do that for me, the unfold 3D layout, but because I am using a untested version of my, untested by me at least, it did not. So, yay, surprises. Okay, we can look for something like this. I could potentially change the direction of this. This is just the ground chunk. I could also make this one smaller if we're never going to see it. The only reason I might want to keep it the same proportion is to make sure the bevels match, which is an interesting concept. I could also set this at an angle here because the ground area I'm not going to care about too much. So if this gets me fitting into this space, I'll do it. I won't like it, but I'll do it. So something like that, and I might bring these down slightly. So like I mentioned, unless this is going to show at some point, we probably don't even need it. I mean, I could actually delete this too. But seeing as we might want to use this for something, I'll keep it there. And then this very top piece, I can kind of just shove in between these like so. Or maybe even put it at the bottom here, because I might use the laser here in another spot. Now, as far as these go, we can make these a lot bigger. But before we do, it would be good to kind of interlock these so they take up less volume in terms of width. So you can see I could do something like this and make them stack tall like the ones we have, potentially. Let me go ahead and bring everything together, though, so we can see this visually. I'm going to select all the objects at once here to do that. And we can decide if this is the best method. So like I mentioned, this is going to allow us to kind of create a piece that we can just stack tall and next to each other, which is good. So that way it gives us the ability to kind of really scale these if we want to, to add more detail to them. In things like film, we generally want to keep the textile detail, evenly. The same goes for games, but there are exceptions, right? So if keeping everything even means wasting the space, then there's not really a point. You want to make sure you're using the space as efficiently as possible. So a lot of the times what that means is scaling things so the textile densities aren't always the same. And a great example is something like a character, right? You wouldn't want the textile density of the eye to be the same as the body, because you want to get all that detail in the eye even though it's small. Kind of depends on the game, but something like this, we could stack all these together. I could come down here to maybe the vertice. I'm going to snap to this thing's vertice here. I want to get a corner vertice. And I could even snap to the grid now underneath it using X. So D and then X here to snap. And then scale from this point as big as we can get these. And I'll do that initial pass, and then we can move these around and adjust them as needed. And if we want to try it again, we could try it again. Now, I think this is probably about as good as it's going to get with these without having to get too much into adjusting the buffer, the edge padding buffer on everything else. But I could continue to kind of move things around, kind of wiggle the amount of space they take up, and get, a little bit more optimized detail out of here. So for example, if I move those over, then maybe I could scale this a little bit more. And this is one of those iffy areas, right? I could turn this sideways, but for the sake of consistency, maybe I don't want to, but maybe I do just take these like this and see if we can't push these more, and then I'll just scale one of these or rotate it sideways, or maybe I can stack it over here, differently by moving some things around. So it's a bit of a game. If you like puzzles, you'll probably enjoy UV layouts. Most people, UV layouts, it's something they struggle with for a very long time. Once you've done enough of them, you start to recognize patterns where it doesn't matter. You can kind of pick up on things quickly. But it does take a while to get to that point. If you guys struggle with it, the real key is just to UV often and start to look for patterns you recognize. All right, so I'm going to bring these in here like this. That should be good. I could probably use the space a bit better, in all honesty. I could even maybe change this up. I'm going to make this slightly smaller here. And I'm just going to make it actually lay flat, so that way I don't need to worry about UVing or texturing it. So we'll make it fill that space a little bit more. Remember, that's the bottom. We don't care about the bottom. And then lastly, we have the laser here. The laser, I could move around and figure out how I want this to go. There should be enough space at the bottom. Certain things we don't need a whole lot of detail. So the laser is just going to be an emissive map. It's just going to be like a glow, right? So it's not going to have details. So I can actually make it fairly small and towards the bottom here. The key to this, though, is that I want to make sure I don't bump into anything else on accident. Because if there's just the slightest bit of that glow on something else, it's really going to stand out. So I want to make sure this has its own little space here. It's not leaking onto anything else, or I guess the proper term would be bleeding onto anything else. I could make these come down here, and I could just scale this down a little bit. So like I mentioned, this doesn't need a whole lot of detail. The other thing, though, is I might end up stretching this if I don't want that extra edge in the center. So that's something I might also need to come in and adjust later after we mirror this over. But something like that's going to give us a fairly nice UV layout. If I wanted to deal with this now, I could. So, for example, we could come to this object, and I could do a mesh mirror. And this one would be across X. X plus 0.001, so these are welded. And here's kind of the catch I mentioned. You can see this is inside out. So what I would want to do is an unfold here, so that way they're both unfolded. And then I would need to come into the center edge and do a move and sew. So we could do a cut, so, move and so. Double click this edge now, and I could do an edit mesh, delete edge by vertex. And then this is going to be my new piece. That's the correct size. So since I don't want that centered line, I'm going to do that now. And that just means I'm going to make this even smaller. I'm going to scale uniformly. And that will give it its own little corner down there. And remember, we don't need a whole lot of detail on that because we're just going to make it glow. All right. So once you're done with those UVs, let's go ahead and hit delete. Let's save, and we're going to do a test bake next to see if it's good to go. And if it is, we can go ahead and clean this up and get it prepped to go into Substance Painter. So let's go ahead and talk about baking real quick inside of Maya for the purpose of testing. If you're unfamiliar with baking, you can look at the Polycount website and find their texture baking section and read through this. This will talk a lot about what baking is, what kind of maps you can bake, and all that good stuff. So a very detailed read. I encourage you guys to check that out. What baking is to us is basically allowing us to take our high poly information and project it onto our low poly mesh. Now, there are some things we need to take into consideration when it comes to baking, and one of those things is going to be how normals are being handled. In other words, these soft and hard edges. So there's a general rule for baking, which is if you have a 90-degree angle, you need a hard edge. And if it's less than 90 degrees, you need soft. So less than 90, we're going to use soft. I say this as a general rule because it's not always the case. It really kind of depends on what the shape is, how you've modeled it, the underlying topology, and all that stuff. And you'll kind of get that as you go through and you do more stuff. But what I like to do is a test bake before I go into Substance. I like to try and set up all my normals. And I do a test bake to make sure the UVs are working and the normals are working using a software like Maya, so that way I don't have to go back and forth. Another thing to be aware of is all software bakes differently. So you may get an amazing bake out of Maya, and then run into an issue in Substance. And this could be with how you're naming things, how you're exporting them, what things you have turned on, what things you don't have turned on. The other thing is sometimes one software is just better at baking something than another software. So an example from my own portfolio, the dragon that I showed earlier in this course that I made for Kingdom Maker, it utilizes normal maps on the high poly, and on the toes and tail tip. So these areas, the tail, the toes, I actually baked the normals in Maya, and I composited them onto the normals from Substance Painter because they had issues in Substance Painter that weren't appearing in Maya. So sometimes you bake in one and then stitch them together in another. So let's take a look at the normals to begin with. I'm going to start with this big structure here. And most of our 90-degree areas are already done. But this area here, for example, is not 90, so I'd select this edge here. And let me go back into our general space so we're not seeing our UVs. I could come in here to our mesh display, and I could just do a soften edge. And what you'll see now is that's going to change how that light hits, but it's going to make it now so we don't get a super hard edge there on the bake, we get a nice soft edge. Same with these edges. These aren't 90 degrees, so I can come in here and I can do a mesh display, soften edge. And that should do the trick for this object. This one here isn't at 90, so I actually might be able to soften this one too. So we'll try that. We'll soften that edge. But something like that, in theory, should give us what we're looking for. I say in theory because you never know till you hit bake. These ones, I think, are all good to go. The 90-degree edges are already hard, so we don't need to make any changes. So now that we have that set up, we can start the bake process, but that first step is going to be checking those normals, and we'll be going back and forth to see if maybe we need to change those still. So just be aware of that. I'm going to save again, and let's take a look at how we can bake in Maya now. We can bake in Maya by coming up here to our rendering menu of all things. And inside of rendering, there is the lighting and shading section, and there's a transfer map section. And if you open this up, you're going to find this very archaic looking menu, but this is going to be what we need. Now, the other thing I need to do is turn back on my high poly, because that's going to be where we're taking the detail from. Now, it's limited what you can bake in Maya, but if you're creative, you can find ways to bake everything. So there's ways you could potentially bake edges and ambient occlusion and all that kind of stuff with file transferring. I've done it. There have been projects I've worked on where we only get to use Photoshop and Maya, so I have done some pretty kooky baking in here. We're just going to use this to set up some normal baking. So if you go ahead and click that, you can create normal maps through here pretty easily by just creating that. You'll see that it's going to create a normal map location, and it's going to have some file types associated. So we're going to want to change these up. The location I want to make sure is going into source images here. You'll see it's going into the scenes. So let's go into source images here. And I'll just go ahead and create a new folder in here called test bakes, because we're probably not going to keep these. And we'll just save this into here and just make it LaserGate test save. And for the format, I'm going to use PNG. That way it's easy. Now, the next thing we need to do is we need to create a target and source mesh up here. So your target mesh is going to be the poly game mesh, the low poly that we just set up with our UVs. This needs to have UVs. It needs these, okay? It absolutely needs those. So what I'll do is I'll grab my game mesh that I just made, which is also called blockout, and just click add. And you'll see Maya's going to come in here and add all of these. Then the next thing I need to do is take the high poly here and put it into the source. The source mesh does not need UVs. We can just add that here. Now I accidentally had the other one selected, so we can click clear all to get rid of those. And I can just add these back in. Now we also have this thing here called an envelope we can play around with. The envelope is the search area that is going to be used. So if I come in here, for example, to the polycylinder shape, that's just the laser beam. I don't need to do that. But this shape here, which is polycube 1, we might want to change that. And I'm actually not sure which one that is based on these names. But we could come in here and switch this to envelope. And if we do that, you'll see this little floating area. Now, when it comes to baking in Maya, we want to make sure that envelope is going outside the entire model that is going to be baked. That's kind of our search area, our search envelope. So I'll want to do that for each of these. I'll just set these to be 9.5 on these ones. I'll go through one at a time and set this up. For some reason, that one doesn't really look like it needs it, which makes me wonder why the other ones do. Maybe they're not moved into the correct location. Not sure. We'll do it anyway, just for practice so you guys can see it here. So let me get those set up. And then we can repeat this process on the other ones here. So you can see this big piece. We have some areas there. Usually your envelope doesn't have to be very big. It usually can be in like the decimal points. And the bigger doesn't mean better in this, by the way. So now that we have those set, we can come down here to the common outputs. I was doing a 2048 map, but usually I bake at about 512. For world space, transfer space, we're just going to leave that in world since they're on top of each other. I'll set the sample quality to high, and we can just click bake and let this do its thing. And then once it's done, we can take a look at how those maps go. You'll notice you have a progress bar down here. It's going to take a bit of time. Once that's done, we'll have our maps, and they will either be hooked up or we can hook them up for us. All right, so I'm going to come back in here and just make sure these are set to mesh. If you don't have them set to mesh, they'll go to envelope. We can check out our blockout model now. That's going to be this one here. And if you hit the 6 key, it should have your bake mesh applied. So 6 is going to turn on textures. So we can see how that's looking. You'll see it looks a bit wonky. Now, the reason why is you do need to come into the settings here. We can delete the history on this. It looks like we didn't before. But we can navigate to the Lambert it hooked up, go into the bump mapping here, and just make sure this is set to utility raw. And if you do that now, this should actually look halfway decent. So what we're checking for is any major issues. I can come in here and set this to a blend if I want it to be shiny, and that sometimes makes it a little bit easier to see. I can darken that up. And you can see we're getting all that really nice high poly detail onto our object. Now, some areas that are problematic are these here, where the objects interact. We can get around that by doing something called an explode bake, and if you want to Google that term, you can find out what it means. I'm not going to worry about it here because we're not going to ultimately be using Maya for this. We're going to use Substance Painter. And in Substance Painter, we can actually do an explode bake via naming. But looking at this, we can get an idea that, hey, we're going to need to get that explode bake. I don't see any issues here with the normals. You can see the nice soft and normals we have, they're all working. So at the end of the day, this is looking pretty nice. The only area that's a bit weird is up here, how that starts to turn. And we can see if maybe that's an issue with the high poly or if it's a UV issue. And it looks like it may be a UV or projection issue, so we'll have to look out for that on our final projection. There's not really too much we could do here, but we could potentially add in some support geometry, maybe an edge loop here to help those normals catch better. So that's something we could consider, and then later on we could come in and delete that. But just be mindful, this is indeed our low poly game mesh. You can see all that detail has been mapped onto the surface. And you can see why I was saying we don't really need to model that, because now from a distance this looks fine. And even if we get up pretty close to this, it still holds up and looks like a ledge. This would be, you know, kind of taking up the whole screen, okay? But that confirms everything we've done works here. At this stage, we can go ahead and do some cleanup and get our file all up and ready. I think we'll do that when we get into going into Substance Painter next. All right, so let's go ahead and save our progress. And that's going to be it for today's tutorial on setting up the game mesh, unwrapping the UVs, and performing our test bake in Maya. Now you're one step closer to bringing your asset into Substance Painter for texturing. In the next video, we're going to take this model and go through the process of setting it up to go into Substance Painter for the texture baking process, and adding textures to bring it to life. If you enjoyed the series, don't forget to like and comment and subscribe so you're ready for the next step. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.